Greetings, everyone, and thank you for extending the invitation for me to share a message with you all today. My name is Marisa Hulstine, and I'm a soon-to-be graduate of Union Theological Seminary's MA program with a concentration in social ethics. I recently finished my thesis entitled Embodiment Ethics in the Face of Purity Culture, an examination through the lens of womanist and feminist theologies, a project inspired by my background growing up in a conservative evangelical church in town in rural Colorado. I had begun to recognize that the pain I experienced in the church was not of God. By realizing and deconstructing my faith, I decided to explore healthier avenues in rebuilding and understanding my relationship with God. I was introduced to looking at scripture through a liberationist, feminist, and womanist perspective, and I began to realize that a God who became human in the person of Jesus could not get held simultaneously with a church that proclaimed purity culture, where bodies are controlled and marginalized. I began with this background introduction because it connects to why I chose to focus on this story of this Syrophoenician or Canaanite woman and Jesus. I cannot remember if I had ever heard someone in the church talk about this story growing up. So when I came across it, I experienced some confusion. Jesus is not who I thought Jesus would be in this text because he seems closed off, turning away a woman who is asking for help. A woman who is a mother with a child in need of healing, and she gets turned away. Many biblical commentaries grapple with this story. Gail R. O'Day, a feminist biblical scholar, states, "This portrait of Jesus' intransigence and the impingement of the Gentile woman has been a stumbling block to many interpreters. There is a hesitancy to recognize either the mutability of Jesus or the powerful presence of the woman. I understand O'Day's statement to mean that we struggle to see a stubborn Jesus who denies the voice of a marginalized woman. We are not used to seeing someone change Jesus' mind, because if he is God in flesh, then why would he do this scene? And doubly, women have generally been underestimated, undermined, and marginalized. So it can shock people to see a woman challenge a male figure, especially Jesus. So it's therefore a confusing text, and I do not have the answers to a clear understanding of it because it's complex. Biblical scholars, interpreters, and theologians will continue to unravel that story. But what I choose to feature among this complexity is that a woman challenged Jesus, and she came out on top. How she showed persistence is vital in considering our current contemporary relations in church and society. As the text says, the woman approaches Jesus asking for help, but Jesus ignores her, and the disciples do not want her invading their space. The woman calls for them to pay attention, and Jesus chooses to respond. He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Not only does Jesus refuse to help at first, but he goes as far as to insult her. Jesus compared her to a dog. Feminists and womanist scholars make sure to frame the lived experiences that this woman came from and connect that to why she was insulted in this way. Depending on the gospel account you read, whether in Matthew or Mark, the woman is either Syrophoenician or a Canaanite. Both identities place her outside of Israel, making her an enemy and not included in Jesus and his disciples' community. She would be considered impure and marginalized outside the roles Roman society demanded with the paterfamilias or patriarchal household. As the feminist biblical scholar Elaine Wainwright says, she is alone, identified only with her daughter, therefore doubly marginalized. She is female in a male world outside the patriarchal family structure, and she is ritually unclean. Many healing stories and interactions that Jesus had in the different gospel accounts happen with people considered outside the community. People like tax collectors, the sick, women, children, and other oppressed people. The lessons and parables of Jesus tend to center around inclusiveness. Everyone can interact with God and is loved by God. But the account of the Canaanite woman is different. Jesus hesitates, and has to be convinced by the woman to live out the values he teaches. Food and crumbs come up in this passage, and it can connect to the continual emergence of bread in the gospel accounts. Jesus speaks of the bread meant to feed Israel as the ministry he brings. Wainwright points out how bread is a constant symbol throughout Christian texts where it is present at the Last Supper and the feeding of the 4,000 and during many community gatherings. Wainwright states that the symbol of bread is introduced into the story, a symbol that is already associated with conflicts, what is eaten, by whom, and how. Bread brings a sense of belonging and inclusion into a community. Partaking of the bread is a sign that you're taking part in the values the community holds close. Denied the bread, the woman persists, calling Jesus to follow his values. If Jesus called her a dog, then she knew that even dogs eat and her place in the world mattered. Her persistence changes Jesus' mind, telling her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed from that moment. I see what this woman did as fully embodying herself. She takes her body's history seriously. She knows she does not get accepted in many circles, but if Jesus follows through on his ministry, then she should get included. The Canaanite woman was the only one in the Gospels who is shown to hold her ground and appeal to Jesus' divine reason over the cultural norms of the day. It was something the disciples were never able to do. They usually never came out on top in a conversation with Jesus. So some interpreters tend to frame the Canaanite woman as begging, but through a lot of feminist, womanist, and liberationist voices, they see her story very differently. Because this Canaanite woman claimed her space and used everything she knew to challenge Jesus because she knew she could. There is power in that. As a womanist biblical scholar, Stephanie R. Buchanan Crowder states, the Canaanite mother sacrifices her body insofar as she dares to speak so boldly to a man in public in a patriarchal society. She puts her mental acumen and emotions on the table as she engages in a verbal contest with Jesus and yields to his language of marginalization for the sake of her daughter. Her work is a sacrifice of her physical, emotional, and mental self, yet in the end, she also reaps spiritual benefits. The Canaanite woman's faith spurs action, and her action brings healing to her child. Now, I feel this story opens up how bodily reclamation occurs in today's world. Many churches and faith spaces have crafted rules on whether someone is pure enough to be accepted in community. It does not only happen in churches, it occurs in public spaces, on the subway, in museums, schools, on the borders, and other places where abuse of power can emerge. If the behavior is not what the dominant society permits, then ostracization, violence, and rejection occurs. Faith spaces can help change that, but it involves being accountable and reflecting upon the ways we fall short in accepting and loving others. The Canaanite woman challenged Jesus, and Jesus listened to her, and Jesus let this woman change his mind. It really turned upside down a lot of the decision-making that operated in the Roman Empire. The head of the family, ultimately represented in the person of the emperor, was the one who crafted society. If it was not in their image, then whole communities faced rejection. Jesus chose not to replicate that structure by listening to the Canaanite woman. The responsibility and accountability Jesus practiced are needed in our world. The bodies of marginalized and vulnerable people have something to say. They speak the visions of how things can be different, and it is our responsibility to listen. The story also shows how our voices have power in challenging those who deem our bodies or other bodies as discardable. There is much to investigate and explore within these verses, even though it remains a complex story. Wherever we find ourselves in our faith journey, I hope that I'm leaving you today knowing that you and others are valued and loved wholly by God, even as those in power try to deny that.